In our video number 10, we are going to extend a discussion on aggregate demand and its components. What is aggregate demand? Since we are discussing the economy as a whole, aggregate demand is a total demand of final goods, which is also called aggregate expenditure. Aggregate supply means the value of total quantity of final goods produced. We are dealing with a closed economy in which we have firms and households, which is called a two-sector economy. In a two-sector economy, firms produce goods and services which are consumed by the households, and households in turn spend their income on buying the goods and services which we call consumption expenditure. The households provide their factor services for which they are paid factor payments or factor incomes by the firms. Now, in this case, all that is demanded by the households will be supplied by the firms. So, can we say that the income which is held by the consumers or households is totally spent on consumption of goods and services? Since we cannot count the physical quantity of goods produced or consumed by the households, we use the total value in terms of money to calculate aggregate demand. That is why we call it aggregate expenditure. Now, the components of aggregate demand in a four-sector economy or an open economy are consumption expenditure, that is the expenditure made by households on the consumption of goods and services, represented by C. The second component is investment expenditure or I. This is the expenditure made on capital by the firms. Government expenditure, represented by G, is the expenditure made by government on consumption of goods and services. The fourth component is net exports, that is exports minus imports. This tells us the relationship between a domestic country and the rest of the world. So the total aggregate demand or aggregate demand will be equal to the sum of the four components, that is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. But we will restrict our discussion only to a two-sector economy. Hence, aggregate demand for a two-sector economy will be given by AD equal to C, consumption expenditure, plus I, investment expenditure. So, our two-sector economy is limited only to households and firms. We know that consumption expenditure from our previous knowledge C is equal to C bar, which is autonomous consumption, plus the marginal propensity to save, which is also the slope of consumption function of the income. And investment expenditure is equal to the autonomous expenditure, which is also called the ex ante, that is the planned investment, which is going to be the same throughout, irrespective of the income. Therefore, the aggregate demand will be given by substituting the values C bar plus BY plus I bar, or rearranging these, we get AD is equal to C bar plus I bar plus BY, or aggregate demand is equal to A bar. A bar is total autonomous expenditure, which is a sum of autonomous consumption and autonomous investment plus BY, where B is a slope of the aggregate demand function, that is marginal propensity to consume. How is the slope MPC equal to the slope of aggregate demand? Let us try to understand this with the help of a graph. Now here we have a graph. On the x-axis we plot income and output. On the y-axis we plot ex ante aggregate demand, that is the planned aggregate demand. Now previously we learned the autonomous investment is parallel to x-axis. Since it remains the same whatever be the income. Then we have autonomous consumption, which starts much above 0 and then goes upward since there is a positive relationship between income and expenditure or consumption. Now when we add this autonomous investment to autonomous consumption, since investment remains the same, the autonomous expenditure will be depending on the change in consumption or rise in consumption due to rise in income. Hence, it will be parallel to the consumption curve. Two parallel lines mathematically will have similar slope. So, the slope of the consumption curve given by y or MPC is equal to the slope of the AD curve. Let's now try to understand what is aggregate supply. Aggregate meaning the total value. Total value of final goods and services is equal to aggregate supply. This aggregate supply is nothing but the factor payments or factor incomes earned by the households from the firms, which is nothing but national income. The sum of all the final goods and services will be equal to national income. Therefore, aggregate supply is equal to national income or Y, and we know income is equal to consumption plus savings. Now if you look at it graphically, where we plot income and output on the x-axis and ex ante aggregate supply on the y-axis, we find that the AS curve is a 45-degree line, which tells us that there is an equality between income and aggregate supply. As the income increases, so also the aggregate supply. That is why we have equal variables on x and y axis. Now we learnt what was aggregate demand and aggregate supply. At equilibrium, aggregate demand should be equal to aggregate supply. In the short run equilibrium level of income and output, we shall confine our analysis of determination of equilibrium level of income or output in an economy with only two sectors, that is households and firms. So the only components of aggregate demand will be consumption and investment. So we have two approaches to determine the equilibrium level of income and output. The first, aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply approach or AD-AS approach, and the second, saving investment approach. Let's deal with the first one. Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply or AD-AS approach at equilibrium. Now since aggregate supply is equal to national income and aggregate demand is also equal to national income, since AD is equal to AS at equilibrium, or this Y is equal to C plus I. C plus I, consumption plus investment, is nothing but aggregate demand. What happens? Is it always possible that aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply and the economy always runs at equilibrium? Let's see what happens if aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply or aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. How does it form an equilibrium or reach an equilibrium under these two conditions? Now here is a graph that represents AD-AS on the y-axis and income and output on the x-axis. We know AS is a 45-degree line since it is directly proportional to income and output. Autonomous consumption curve is upward sloping, and the aggregate demand curve is parallel to the consumption curve. The point at which AS curve meets the AD curve is the equilibrium. At this point, AD is equal to AS, and we can say that the economy is at equilibrium, E. Let us consider a point on AD curve here. At this point, AD's value is here and income value is here. So at this point, supply is at this point and AD demand is at this point. So we find that demand is greater than supply. So this point below equilibrium is AD greater than AS. When AD is greater than AS, demand is more than supply, we will fall short of the inventory, and so the firms will increase their production in order to meet the demand in the market. This will happen as long as we reach the equilibrium point. Now consider a point on AD curve here. At this point, the AD is here at this point and supply here. Now our demand is at this point and supply is at this point. So here supply is greater than demand. So beyond E, above this over here, we find AD is less than AS. When demand is less than supply, the inventory stock piles up and production falls. When there is decrease in production, people lose their jobs. So we will find unemployment at this stage. So how long will this continue? This will continue as long as we reach the equilibrium point. So the necessary condition for equilibrium is AD is equal to AS, which is equal to Y. The point at which AD is equal to AS is also called the effective demand. Effective demand refers to that level of income or output where ex-ante aggregate demand is equal to ex-ante aggregate supply. That is, AD is equal to AS. Now the questions that are formed over here is something like this. Ex post value of total output is always equal to ex post aggregate expenditure in the economy. Give a reason. How will the economy attain equilibrium when aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply or aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply? In our next class, we will learn about the second approach, the savings investment approach.